Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our program, thousands of people convicted of marijuana-related offenses in San Francisco are cheering a decision by the district attorney to clear their criminal records. And we'll talk with a California activist who attended President Trump's State of the Union address, Denea Joseph of UndocuBlack, a group that represents undocumented black immigrants. Plus, we'll hear from Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom about why he thinks voters should back him as California's next governor. But first, earlier today, House Republicans released a highly disputed memo that alleges the FBI and Justice Department abused their surveillance powers to spy on a former Trump campaign advisor. Several Democrats on the committee, including California Congressman Schiff, are accusing GOP Congressman Gavin Newsom of manipulating the contents of the previously classified memo. President Trump allowed its release despite objections from the FBI and the Department of Justice. This morning, he sent a tweet accusing those two agencies of politicizing the investigative process. Joining me now with more on this latest twist is Congressman Swalwell from the East Bay. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Thuy.
What is your reaction to the release of this memo?
It's very disturbing that the Republicans in the House would be willing to risk our republic to protect the president. And that's what they're doing. They're releasing classified information and they're asserting facts that are not supported by the evidence to protect the president in this Russia investigation. They're doing it over the objection of the FBI, and they are also doing it in a first world democracy where never before have we seen political leaders use our police to attack their political enemies or accuse our police of biases in investigations against them.
So from where you sit on the House Intelligence Committee, what will you do at this point?
The best way we can clean up the distortions that their memo have made is for the Democratic memo to be released on Monday. So we're going to force a vote on Monday. We're going to try and force a vote when we return and have a committee hearing. If our memo were released, the public would see 10 pages of details that lay out the true timeline here, that put into focus that this investigation occurred long before the Steele dossier landed in the hands of the FBI. It'll point out that FBI Deputy Director Andy McCabe, that his characterization in the GOP memo is just flatly wrong, mischaracterized, and that the FISA application is mischaracterized. So I think the American people will walk away seeing new, unseen evidence from our memo, but also the FBI's credibility will be bolstered.
But you already tried to get that memo released last week. The Republican leaders on the committee said no. What do you think will change that this time?
Well, now they have the public to answer to. And the public sentiment right now, I believe, is outrage. Outrage that they would trample all over the rule of law and that they're going to want to see, as I said, the evidence that corrects the record. And
President Trump was asked today, what's his reaction to this? Would he try to fire Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein? And he said, you figure that one out. What do you think that means?
Well, Donald Trump has shown a willingness to just, clear out of his way anyone who's been a part of this investigation. If you think about the individuals who are no longer at DOJ or FBI, from Sally Yates to James Comey to Dana Puente, and now, of course, Andy McCabe retiring this week or being forced out. He has an enemies list, and he, one by one, is removing them from this investigation. We must do all we can in Congress to protect Bob Mueller. There's legislation from Republicans and Democrats to do that. And if this is not an alarm for us to do that when we get back, I don't know what is.
Do you think he would fire Rosenstein?
It looks like he is trying to set the circumstances to fire Rosenstein. And people may ask, well, why does it matter if he fires, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein? It's because he sets the parameters of Mueller's investigation. He approves the expenditures.
He oversees the investigation.
That's right. And so he's actually technically the person who would have to fire Bob Mueller.
So let's just say, hypothetically, if Rosenstein is fired, what would you do? Because you also sit on the House Judiciary Committee, which would take up any impeachment proceedings if they were to happen.
I believe, with the support of others, would immediately move for the House Judiciary Committee to take up impeachment proceedings. If he fired Rosenstein, I believe that is clear obstruction of justice, and the House must act.
Is that an effort that you would lead?
I would work with, with my colleagues and the leaders of the Judiciary Committee and our ranking member, but having, I'm the only Democrat that serves on the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee. I've, had a real look into the evidence that exists here, And I believe that this would be a clear case of obstruction. But I believe our House leaders have already said that that's a red line that he can't cross.
You know, the Republicans are saying that this is a case where there was abuse of surveillance power by the Department of Justice, by the FBI, that Carter Page's constitutional rights were violated in this case. Is it possible that proper procedures and vetting procedures were not followed in this case? I
haven't seen that. You know, the FBI is not above the law, and we should, always look at all of their investigations to make sure that, civil liberties are being protected. But what it looks like here is that the president is trying to go after the FBI to taint their investigation so that the public sentiment or approval of the FBI is reduced. So if more indictments come against the president or his team, that the public reaction would not be as condemning as it probably likely would be. One other point, Twee, is that by the Republicans referring over to the White House this classified memo before it became public, they essentially gave the White House pieces of evidence in the Russia investigation that the White House and the president may not have otherwise seen. That's important because they're essentially allowing them now to tailor their testimony, the president or the White House counsel, around the evidence that they now know exists.
Well, there's so much more to discuss on this. We will definitely watch it, but I can't let you go without asking you about the budget as well, because the next deadline to reach a deal on government spending is February 8th, next Thursday. And Democrats had agreed to reopen the government after the 3-day shutdown last month with a reassurance from Republicans that there would be good faith negotiations on immigration. Has that happened? Has any progress been made?
Negotiations are underway. I think it is, however, reckless for us to just continue to govern 2 to 3 weeks at a time. It's not fair to the American people. We should be able to solve our immigration challenges, the challenges around also funding, healthcare centers in our communities and our military. But we shouldn't do this 2 to 3 weeks at a time. That's not fair to the American people. And I've seen student councils in elementary schools budget, farther out than that.
What would you need to see happen on DACA, on immigration, in order for you to support a long-term budget bill?
Well, we can address the Dreamer issue by giving certainty to the nearly 700,000 Dreamers who already signed up under DACA. And then if there are other issues around border security or reforming our immigration process, we should look at those. But right now, the president is proposing that we reform and fix DACA, and the trade-off is that we end legal immigration that's existed, like family reunification in our country, for over 50 years. And I'm not going to make that trade.
It's a non-starter for you.
That's a non-starter for me, and it's unfair to put the Dreamers in that position.
So then, just real quickly, would you back the threat of another government shutdown if you can't reach a compromise?
Well, I'm not going to propose a government shutdown. I'm going to propose that we think big and solve, the issues that we were sent to take care of.
All right, Congressman Eric Swalwell, always great to have you on the program. Thank you
pleasure.
For making the time. On Tuesday, President Trump delivered his first State of the Union address. Attending that night as a guest of California Senator Kamala Harris was a young undocumented immigration activist named Denea Joseph. Joseph is the communications director for UndocuBlack Network, a group that advocates for undocumented Black immigrants. And Denea Joseph joins us now via Skype from Los Angeles. Denea, nice to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Twee.
So what was that like to attend the State of the Union speech?
It was a very bittersweet experience in that this was the largest delegation of undocumented youth to be present at the State of the Union address. But then also we had to sit and listen to a lot of the xenophobic vitriol that was being spread at the State of the Union by President Trump.
Well, tell us a little bit about your personal story, because I know with the UndocuBlack Network, one of your missions is to get the stories of immigrants such as yourself out there. You came to the U.S. from Belize at the age of 7. How did you get to this country?
I came to this country because my parents wanted me to have access to opportunities that I otherwise wouldn't have had if I remained in Belize, Central America. It was one of those experiences as the eldest child. They knew that I would be the closest one to be able to access institutions of higher learning. And they wanted me to get opportunities that they themselves didn't get. So as a result of that, they sent me to live with my maternal grandmother in the United States.
You're part of the UndocuBlack Network, and is an advocacy group that serves undocumented Black immigrants. How big is that population, and how are you going about getting your message out?
We actually have 619,000 UndocuBlack people represented in the United States. And as a result of that, we at the UndocuBlack Network seek to send our message by making sure that our voices are amplified both locally, statewide, and nationally. So we go about it by doing interviews, doing op-eds, doing videos that showcases the diversity of the immigrant community, something that we often don't talk about enough. So when you have comments that are made by the president and his administration about blank hole countries, and he's referring to Haiti and countries on the African continent, that's what it took in order for a lot of people to understand that immigration is a Black issue.
What has life been like for you as an undocumented immigrant living under the Trump administration?
Chaotic would be an understatement, in that each day we definitely do not know what's going to happen. A few weeks ago, we had the Trump administration as well as leaders from both parties give a press conference or have a meeting in the midst of a press circus, and they spoke about the importance of being able to pass a Clean Dream Act. And moments later, then we heard rhetoric that they wanted to do so at the risk of family reunification programs and almost the elimination of diversity visas. So we do not know what to expect. We hear rhetoric that says Clean Dream Act, but then we also hear attempts to use the 800,000 DACA recipients against the remainder of the immigrant population.
But I think in his latest proposal, at least the one he put forth in his State of the Union address, he made it pretty clear that he's willing to offer a 12-year path to citizenship for DACA recipients, but pair that with billions of dollars for a wall along the Mexican border and tighter restrictions on legal immigration. What do you think of that? Is there any part of that you could support in place of a clean DACA Act?
It is a very problematic proposal that's being made, because for him to offer 1.8 million people, there's 11.5 million undocumented people in the United States of America. So to try to use 1.8 or 800,000 DACA recipients against the remainder of the population is creating an us versus them mentality, in which you're trying to label the DACA recipients or undocumented youth as coming here at no fault of their own, but you're criminalizing their parents and setting up families to be separated from one another, becoming susceptible to detention and deportation and elimination from being able to provide for their families and create a sustainable lifestyle. So while the pathway to citizenship is a great aspect, then we're going to be addressing these longer term implications in which the remainder of the undocumented population is going to be left to fend for themselves. And that's simply something that I cannot get behind.
There are a number of people, especially conservative Republicans, who feel that by offering a path to citizenship for dreamers such as yourself, it amounts to amnesty, and they feel that that's wrong. They feel that it is wrong to put dreamers in ahead of the line, if you will. What do you have to say to them?
Well, first and foremost, there is no line for immigrants like myself. If there was a line, it would have been something that we would already got into the process of. As somebody who's been in this country for 15 going on 16 years, DACA is a merit-based program, one in which I have to submit $495 every 2 years to renew. I've had to submit to a federal background check. I've had to pay taxes. I'm asking the government permission in order to work in this country and pay taxes. That, to me, does not read as a handout. It is something that we've worked very hard for. And not to mention, undocumented people have contributed to the social, economic, and political fabric of this nation. So it's anything but a handout.
All right. Denea Joseph, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Twee.
It's been 1 month since recreational marijuana became legal for adults in California. Now, San Francisco residents with criminal convictions for some marijuana-related offenses will see their slates wiped clean. This week, San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon announced he will retroactively expunge or reduce thousands of convictions going back as far as 1975. And District Attorney Gascon joins me now to talk about his decision. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So what are you hoping to accomplish by automatically erasing about 3,000 misdemeanor marijuana convictions?
Right. So there are really three things that I'm trying to accomplish. Number one, we know that most of the communities were heavily impacted by the war on drugs and the war on marijuana were poor people, people of color, you know, the African American community. And those people generally would be hard-pressed to hire an attorney and go through the legal process that Prop 64 requires in order to petition to have their misdemeanor conviction expunged or have a felony conviction reduced to a misdemeanor. We also know the impact that a criminal record has. We know that it often precludes you from getting employment, housing, government assistance.
Loans.
And quite frankly, on a felony case, you can't even vote, right? So we want to make sure that we right that wrong. We also want to encourage other prosecutors around the state to do the same thing. So we're creating a blueprint for this to occur in a way that is painless to the individual. And then finally, we want to send a message, a national message. You know, we're at a time where we have the national administration, the attorney general, you know, talking about marijuana being almost an existential threat to our communities. We still have marijuana as a Schedule I drug, which puts it on equal par with heroin, which is obscene. And we want to make sure that we get that dialogue going. You know, if you talk to a high school kid today or 30 years ago, they would laugh, right, at this obscenity that is putting marijuana at that level. And when the law is not credible, it becomes a hypocrisy and people don't believe in it.
There are those, though, who look at what you have done and said, well, you know, it was a crime back then. And so if you committed a crime back then, it should stay in the record, regardless of what happens, what changes to the law were made.
Yeah, but you know, that really sort of ignores the equity and the fairness and what is right. You know, it shouldn't have been a crime back then. And we decimated entire communities. And secondly, how arbitrary would it be that if you were arrested for a marijuana offense, December 31st of 2017, you're a criminal, but you engaged in the same conduct on January 1 of 2018, and you're no longer a criminal.
And you touched on this earlier when you talked about the racial discrepancies and the way that marijuana laws have worked out in terms of the justice system and the enforcement. There have, in 2011, for example, African Americans made up 6% of San Francisco's population, yet they accounted for nearly half of the city's marijuana-related offenses. So with this new policy, what do you think will be the impact on that discrepancy? What kinds of reform will it accomplish in the long run?
I think, look, it's the beginning of reducing the harm of decades-old policy that has really decimated poor people and especially the African American community. There are many studies that would tell you that drug use in this country is distributed equally amongst the racial groups. In fact, some will even say that sometimes in the white communities, marijuana use is greater than in the African American community. Yet, when you see who were the people that were arrested, the people that were convicted, the people that went to jail and prison, there always seem to be people of color. And the African American community has suffered the most in this process.
I also want to ask you about immigration. Federal immigration authorities issued a directive this week that would allow immigration and customs enforcement agents to go to courthouses and make arrests. They say they will only target public safety threats such as convicted criminals or gang members and not take in family or friends or witnesses, for example, for deportation. What do you think of the directive?
Well, I think it's very wrong-headed. I think it's driven by ideology and xenophobic, beliefs in the new administration. I think that the reality is that courts ought to be a place where witnesses and victims can come in without being fearful that they may be arrested because they're here without documents, or someone that they know may be arrested without being here legally.
But federal immigration authorities will argue that, a courthouse is a safe place where they can make these arrests because there are metal detectors there.
But here's the problem, okay, and we're experiencing that already. We have seen a drop in the number of reported domestic violence incidents amongst immigrant communities, both in the Chinese and the Latino community. LA has seen similar drops. We now have victims of domestic violence that have refused to come to court because they are afraid that they may be subject to deportation. So it doesn't really matter what the federal government says, that they're going to do this or that. Their credibility within the immigrant communities is non-existent. Frankly, I have my own doubts. And the problem is, at the end of the day, public safety is about people availing themselves of the criminal justice system, and this actually puts people out of the system.
And another immigration-related issue, ICE has just served 77 Bay Area businesses with notices for inspection, demanding that they present employment verification. What do you think of that move, and do you anticipate this being the sign of an even tougher crackdown to come?
Well, first of all, it's very interesting that the Bay Area gets selected for this, right? It seems to me to be somewhat vindictive, given that obviously the Bay Area has seemed most of the time to be aligned in politics that do not seem to be, what the president wants. And when law enforcement engages in a vindictive prosecution, nothing good comes out of it. I think.
Is there anything your office can do to counter this if a crackdown happens?
No, I mean, clearly the federal government has jurisdiction over this area, and there's nothing that we can do. And I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't do the work. I just find it very odd that this region seems to be taking the brunt of it.
All right. DA George Gascon, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, and thank you so much.
As Jerry Brown serves out his final year as governor, there's a vigorous campaign to replace him. The early leader in terms of poll numbers and fundraising is Democratic Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom. His campaign has raised nearly $20 million, but the former San Francisco mayor is facing criticism from his rivals over issues such as his support for single-payer health care coverage. KQED's politics editor Scott Schaefer sat down with Gavin Newsom earlier this week.
Lieutenant Governor Newsom, thanks for coming in.
Great to be here.
You are running to succeed Jerry Brown, and it'd be hard to imagine two people more different than Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom in terms of style, age, demeanor. So why are you the guy to replace him?
I've known Jerry literally my entire life, and there's a lot of truth to that. Stylistically, I tend to step up and step in, not as passive in certain issues. The knock on me, or the thing people liked, was I was the 12th member of the Board of Supervisors when I was mayor of San Francisco. In terms of my legislative agenda, I tend to want to lead on reforms, not wait for them to land on my desk.
What's an example of an issue where you would be less passive?
Issue of health care. It's devouring the budget of the state. Look, in this country, it's 17.9% of GDP, $3.3 trillion a year. You can't have a budget conversation. You can't have a pension conversation. You can't have a conversation as it relates to the issues of small business growth unless you're having a healthcare conversation. That's one where I'd take the reins a little more.
High-speed rail. It is in trouble. It is. It's limping along. It is being built, but at the moment it could be a train to nowhere. At what point would you abandon it? Because there may not be federal money, there may not be private sector money.
Yeah, I don't want to even speculate about that. I want to see if we can bring this thing together. The key is getting that private sector money. That's the missing leg of the three-legged stool. Also continue to advocate for more federal dollars. Look, we're patching this together. We're keeping this thing going. You got 1,600 folks quite literally working as we speak. This thing is actually under construction. And the redesign of the first phase, valley to valley, actually provides tremendous utility for this region, and it's fastest growing part of the state, the Central Valley. So this is not a boondoggle, as some have asserted it is, unless we abandon the vision because we couldn't find funding, and that's my commitment to try to find those
dollars. You see just connecting the valleys, Silicon Valley and the Central Valley, and say, you know what, that's all we can do?
I have confidence we will get that phase done. There's no doubt in my mind that worst case, you get that phase done. We get the electrification of Caltrans, which will be a game changer up here. So the northern part of the state is best positioned to be well served by the status quo, but I really feel a sense of responsibility to Southern California that really has been left wanting in this respect, because that issue of getting those tunnels through and above the Tehachapi Mountains and the San Gabriel Mountains remains a profoundly open question and an open wound, candidly, for a lot of the elected officials down there that rightfully have been critical.
Governor Brown has not been shy about saying no to Democrats when it comes to spending. Are you willing to say no?
Yeah, it's going to be hard, but anyone who's followed my time as mayor of San Francisco knows that was a word I used often. We balanced 7 budgets without laying off police officers, firefighters, nor do we lay off teachers.
What would you say no to?
Oh, I mean, you've got to balance budgets. You've got to be fiscally disciplined. But at the same time, I also want to recognize a fundamental fact that unless we deal with the issue of income and wealth disparities and the issue of social mobility, this state's going to collapse on itself. 8 million people living below the poverty line, 24% of our kids below the poverty line, 46% at or near the poverty line. Those are stubborn facts that the next governor has to address.
Sexual harassment has been a big issue rocking Sacramento and the country. And I'm curious, when this began to happen with Harvey Weinstein and then it all unfolded, what went through your mind? What questions did you ask?
It was very personal. My wife was the second person to come out impacted directly by Harvey. So candidly, it was very personal in that respect because she had the courage to come forward and also to talk to me about what happened in ways that she hadn't in the past, which was pretty jaw-dropping. As it relates to Sacramento, the courage was also demonstrable, all those women that came forward. And they deserve affirmation, they deserve justice, and they most importantly deserve reforms.
Would you support penalties against legislators who are found guilty of harassment or sexual assault? And should the public be paying money for these settlements?
Yeah, I think the settlements we got to bring to light. I mean, I think it's unfortunate we've been signing all these settlement checks without asking any questions for years and years and years.
What questions would you ask?
Well, the fact is, we are just signing off on settlements that have one purpose, and that's not to allow the light of day and the women to come forward. At the end of the day, taxpayer dollars certainly shouldn't be used for the malfeasance and the absolute sort of offense that is occurring by legislative leaders or members of staff. There has to be personal accountability in that respect, and I certainly would support that.
One of the problems with cannabis operations is all the cash, because there's no banks to use that can accept the money. What would you do about that?
Well, for the last year and a half, we've been promoting this idea of a state bank. That's not going to be easy. You talk about needing federal waivers and all kinds of special interests. They're going to do everything to make sure that doesn't happen. There are a lot of credit unions that are quietly actually accepting the cannabis cash and are hopeful that the federal government stays pat and doesn't necessarily interfere with that. But this is not an issue unique to California by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just a blue state issue. You've got red states and blue states with medical marijuana that have the same open-ended questions. And so I think eventually, and I hope in the near term, this will be addressed appropriately. The federal level will remove the status of this being a Schedule I drug, which is preposterous and absurd.
If you win, you're going to take office in 2019, 2020, right around the corner. Can you say definitively you will not run for president?
That is not my aspiration. California will be well served by having a governor who's working full time on the state's business. And by the way, quite substantively, the one regret I hear more often privately, not just publicly, of Governor Brown, is that he came back to make up for the fact that he had his eye off the ball and was doing a lot of things in those first early terms where, frankly, he had a presidential lens, not the lens on California. And what a contrast, what he's accomplished in the last 7 years versus, I think, being focused elsewhere in those previous 7 years is, I think, a tell that we need a governor who's working full-time on the state.
Did I hear you say you don't want to be president ever?
No, who wants that? With all due respect, ex-president sounds like a great job. No,
well, there's only one way to get there. You know that.
No. I'm looking in the, here's a tape. You'll have this tape. No.
Lieutenant Governor, thank you very much.
Thanks.
You heard it here from Gavin Newsom, no for president. And that does it for us. You can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.